So let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everybody had a good lunch. It was a pretty good spread, out there? Come on in. My name is Sharon O'Mara. I work for the Bank of Montreal in technology, and I am pleased to introduce our speaker this afternoon with a presentation entitled On Lockdown, Requirements Change Management. And our speaker is Hans Ekman. Hans Ekman provides transitional consulting and management for rapidly changing companies. With 17 of his over 20 years experience creating workflow optimization solutions across diverse industries. He is currently the Innovations Team Manager at SunTrust Bank and provides process improvement and mentoring through the Business Analyst Center of Excellence that he co-founded. Hans is a frequent speaker and mentor with a BS and a Master's of Education from the University of Georgia. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Hans Ekman.
Hey, thanks for coming out. I appreciate it. So, who here works in an organization where you participate in projects that do not change anything in the organization? Who here works on projects that do not have any errors, omissions, changes in the business? Everything's fluid, nice, great, awesome. Okay, so now that we got all those people out of the room, I wanted to first thank you for coming out and for joining us today. This is an active participation, so feel free to move forward. We've got plenty of open seating. Come on in, join the fun. We're just getting started. On your way out, make sure and grab my business card. The green one is where you can go to download immediately a copy of this presentation and any of the other ones I've given. And I also encourage you to join me tomorrow for how to market yourself for a better career. It's been a very popular one. For those of you that are tweeting during the event, there's two hashtags I want to tell you about. BAOT and PMOT are global hashtags referring to the business analysis and project management best practices. And then for this event, you have the Project World and Project World hashtags. So feel free to use those. They'll be at the bottom of the presentation as we go. So I want to start off with a few disclaimers. First, this session's for you. I kind of already know this material, so I wanted to turn this into a discussion. I want to find out. We've got plenty of time to discuss that. And if not, we can, as we get through, we'll be able to go back at the end and answer any questions. Universal disclaimer, the thoughts, ideas, comments during this presentation are mine and mine alone and do not necessarily represent the bank I work for. Also, absolutely no animals were harmed during the creation of this presentation, but I encourage you to support your local rescue groups. So, think back to the last project you finished. Wouldn't it have been great if you knew what that end state was going to look like before you started? You knew exactly what you were going to produce at the end? What if you had to take a certification exam and you got a copy of the exam, or at least generally what the questions were ahead of time? Wouldn't it make it a lot easier to study? Well, I'm going to do the same thing here. So I'm going to give you the conclusions up front, and you can decide whether or not you agree and whether or not they're right. And we're going to go into these in a lot more details. First, the principles of release management and project change management can be applied to requirements, and actually applied very effectively. And as someone asked before the session, well, what happens? Isn't this the old way of doing things? What about Agile? This actually fits better into Agile than it may in traditional waterfall projects. All depends on how you apply. This is more of a applied or theoretical look at change management. So if anybody's looking for a cooking recipe, if I do these 10 things, I'll be successful. I apologize in advance. We're not going to quite get there. You must have a level of control that matches the threat and the risk. So we're going to take a look at what overkill is or how much attention you need to pay. And the other thing is, this isn't just something that you do. This isn't just, a point in time that appears as a milestone on your project schedules. This is something that becomes a way of life. It gets built into your daily habits. So let's take a look, because we all participate in ideal projects. So let's start and take a look at the happy path and the ideal projects that we have. First, we always know that all of our stakeholders agree at the beginning of a project. And they know exactly what they want. And their needs and their thoughts and their desires aren't going to change at all during the project. Especially the longer the project, the less likely any of their ideals are to change. Also, while we're working, we're not going to have any defects. We're not going to miss any requirements. There's not going to be any ambiguities. We're not going to run into any technology constraints or timing constraints or budget constraints. None of that's going to happen. It's all going to go super smoothly. And the business itself isn't going to change. The market, once we activate a project, the entire universe stops and nothing changes. So our businesses don't have to react to anything at all. So that's our participation.
Can I work for SunTrust?
Well, this is the unicorn scenario, so as soon as I find the unicorn, I'm happy to share it. But, I mean, this isn't reality. This isn't what we deal with. But why do we care about change? So when we normally talk about change management, a lot of us are thinking about what happens during the project, in flight, what you find during testing, what you find during sign-off. But it actually goes a little bit deeper than that. The cost of change is pretty extreme. And in the back of the presentation, so you can download this immediately and take this back to your organization and take full credit when you share this with them as your own work, I have the references to these studies. If you are looking at an agile or an iterative type environment, basically what we start off with is, what is the cost of a change? What's the cost of a unit of labor? So if our organization says a unit of labor costs $50 an hour, and that's what we based our estimate on, then any changes, anything we do during our requirements and design phase is factored at that $50 rate. Now, if I jump down and say coding and unit testing, so the TASIS is an iterative, BAWorld is in waterfall. So if I start finding stuff when I start doing coding and unit testing, in an iterative environment, that change is going to cost me 5 times as much now that I've actually begun work. In waterfall, it only costs me 3 times as much, because there's a little bit less risk there. When I start getting into integration testing in an iterative environment, that $50 change now costs me $500. It costs $350 if I'm in waterfall. And this is why Agile and other iterative environments are now becoming so popular, is because instead of fixing the problem at the beginning, like Pixar does, Pixar challenges and tries to fail as fast as possible, throwing out and identifying all the bad ideas before they've drawn one circle to start the first character. So what you see is, when you start leaving and start finding your mistakes towards the end, the cost goes up astronomically. So you're looking at 15 times the cost in an iterative environment, 50 times the cost now in waterfall. And when you get into allowing your customers to doing your testing for you, you're now up to 100 times the cost in waterfall and 30 times as much in Agile. So as we're going through, please stop, interrupt, ask questions as we go along. So that's all well and good. We know where the costs are, but where are we introducing most of our problems? Most of our errors or changes are introduced during integration testing. So again, this is kind of where Agile tried to attack that. Yes?
So you mean just define integration testing so we're on the same page?
Yep.
Integrate between components, or?
Depending on how the organization, so typically you've got unit testing where an isolated piece of code or a portion of the system works. When it now has to interact with other parts of the systems or legacy systems, that's when we start to find out my user story isn't supported, my use case isn't, it doesn't plug in, I've got limitations, mainframe has to be 8-character or lowercase,
right.
passwords, but my security policy demands a 64-character with 17 special characters, and you start running into those conflicts. So what we're seeing is we find or introduce most of our changes during integration testing. The next is during coding and unit testing, followed by, or going along with that in post-production release. A couple other things. The less critical your system, the less expensive it is to make changes. And that kind of makes sense if you think about it when you've really got customer data, transactions. There's such a reliance on that, you're going to see a much bigger impact. You've got a lot more steps. So instead of being 100 to 1 on a small, trivial, maybe a departmental system, you're only looking at 5 to 1, so you really reduced your risk automatically. 50%, 40 to 50% of everything that we're doing today is waste. That kind of depresses me. I'd like to think that half of my work week wasn't throwaway. But right now, it really is. So if you can start to tie that down, look at the great impact you're going to have in the organization. And no matter how many times we preach, and no matter how many times we say, we need to understand the needs and the scenarios and everything up front, that continues to be where we cut the most and where we are causing the most rework. I think the only thing cut more than requirements is training and user documentation at the end, if they're even a part of the project.
Why do you think that is?
I think there's a couple factors. The first is most people don't know what they want until they see it. And in traditional, the system shall requirements, you don't see it until the very end. So there's no wireframes, there's no flow charts, there's no storyboards, there's no user stories. So the more visual, the better you can bring the requirements into a format where people can understand it, the better. The other, and I'm going to talk more about this as a way of life rather than just a change management process, is when we start a project, we think about it as, okay, what is the net new thing I'm going to do? Or, the new system will do everything the old system did with the following changes. Which is, if you see a project scope defined that way, apply for a different job. I mean, get out of the way. There's an incredible book, Death March Project Management. It was written in the early 80s. It basically is all about how to recognize doomed projects. The first third is how to recognize a doomed project. The next third is how to get off that project if you get stuck. And the last third is how to survive with your reputation intact when the project fails, because your superhero cape isn't going to be enough to save it. So let's take a look through a very basic life cycle at the types of things when we talk about change. What do we mean? First, throughout the life cycle, we're dealing with ambiguities, clarifications, or invalid requirements. Things we thought were true, things we thought we were communicating. Maybe we understood what we wrote or communicated, but the developer didn't, or the business didn't. Missed requirements. We really don't start seeing missed requirements until we get into development. You know, we think once we hand off our package or a certain sprint worth of requirements, we've got everything. And then once they start doing the design and start putting screens together and flows and data, things start to fall apart. Between our define and our test stage, we're going to get scope and prioritization changes. Your stakeholders are going to want something different. It's inevitable. So we can either prepare for it or not. Now, anyone want to guess why I cut that off before implementation? Can we have scope and prioritization changes after we've implemented?
No.
Too late. I mean, it's done. I mean, you've got to spin off a new project, fund a phase 2, hit the next sprint, but for that effort, it's gone. You also start running into, when you hit development, you start really hitting your constraints. You're going to lose resources. You're going to have design constraints, time constraints, budget constraints. All these things are going to start to close in on your project just when you need them the most. So maybe you had an organization and you had all the resources planned out you needed, you scheduled it, you got approval from their managers and everyone's ready, and then life happened. And when life happens, those people get pulled to other stuff and they're not there. And now one person who knows that legacy system suddenly is on vacation in the month of June, and that's really when you needed them to start the design. We may also miss implementation. I mean, we may hit the fact that we do not have a viable product. We do not have the functionality necessary to go forward. And in that case, we have to really reconsider what we're going to do. And then the last, although kind of this happens in terms of scope and prioritization, really when we look at implementation or getting into implementation is really when we start to notice what the business really needed. And that's when we say, okay, is this good enough? Now let's look at what we need further on down. This is extremely common when you look at replacing legacy systems, where you just say, well, if I can just leapfrog and get here, everything will be okay. And then I'm going to ignore it for 5 to 10 years until it's so archaic, I have to leapfrog again. So the whole foundation of change management is based on identifying the level of threat. And really where this comes from is in disaster scenarios, you have triage levels. A good project manager should be managing based on risk and impact, although everything is always flagged as a high priority, high impact. We can't get around that. But in reality, that's just not true, especially for requirements. So the first thing we have to say is kind of our green state. And this is where we have no material impact. And material is kind of a legal term where are we changing or are we deviating from what people expect? So if I'm decomposing requirements, if I'm decomposing the scope, if I'm elaborating further, but everyone is still in agreement of how it's going to work, I'm just making it clearer, easier to understand, that's really not a change. I mean, it's a change that I have to make updates, but it's not a material change that I'm affecting time, scope, budget, end user functionality, expectations. So that's kind of where material changes. So you may want, as you're going through, to define the characteristics that you consider as a material change or not, because really that's the first divider is, can I make this change communicated without anybody thinking that we've changed what we're delivering? That also accounts for things like spelling mistakes, grammar errors, things that drive especially offshore teams bonkers. Those corrections are very easy to manage. The next is we have a material impact. We're doing something that is changing. We're changing the functionality. Maybe we're changing what menu options. Maybe we're changing the timing of transaction processing. So when this happens, or when we add new requirements, we don't just go in and put them in just because somebody asked for them. You've got to have some level of approval. How formal that is really depends on your organization. But at the very least, I want my stakeholders to sign off and agree on. And maybe not 16 times a day, but maybe I have a scheduled weekly review and say, here's the changes we did, we approve the changes as stated. But at some point, those are going to impact your governance. You're going to have a change which is going to impact scope, schedule, or cost. And it's going to have to go through whatever your formal change management plan is. So again, it's the stakeholder approval. We're going to look at the process. It's exactly the same as a material impact, but with whatever your governance process is to lock that down. So with that, how do I manage this? How much attention do I need to spend? The first is, if they're just, really not a material change, I want to log them. I can use track changes, I can use versioning if I happen to have a requirements tool, I can keep these manually in an online system, a spreadsheet, in a change control log as a part of a document or file or a separate file. Whatever it is, I just want to be able to say, what was the state at a particular point in time? And I'm very big on not just getting approval from the stakeholders who are making decisions about what the system does, but I want to get approval from everyone downstream, because I need to be able to hold them accountable. And I can't hold them accountable if they don't agree to do the work. So my test leads, my development leads, my release management team all have to sign off on changes. So when I get to a material impact, I can't just make this. I need to have a process or a form or something that says, what's the impact? What's going to change? And then make sure that that gets approved. And then if I have the governance change control, it's the easiest one to deal with because you probably all have an official form, an official process, something like that to base it on. So as we look at this, any questions on kind of The difference, really, you've got two groups, material changes and non-material changes, and kind of the level of scrutiny or management that comes with them. Is there a reason why we wouldn't want to do a full impact analysis and get approval for non-material changes? You go crazy, yeah. Who wants to spend that much time documenting and approving, and then your stakeholders can be, come on, you put a comma in. Do I really need to approve that? I mean, if you want to get kicked off a project, that's a great way to go. Document them to death, and it's the fastest way to get transferred. So what is our process? It's kind of a cycle. So we'll look at a way of actually managing everything at change at the very end. But this doesn't really kick in until the first point in time where you have set expectations and people believe that they have agreed to something. So it's not necessarily, in a waterfall environment when you have your final requirements sign off, but when I deliver a solid draft document for review and people say, yes, that's good, or yes, it's good, but make these changes, I have now set expectations. So from that point forward, I want to do a couple things. I want to make sure that my requirements package is a living and breathing document that represents that current state at that particular time. I want to be able to track and know when I introduce things, and I need to know the delta. Your testers and your developers will hate you if they have to read through an entire document every single week, every single month, trying to figure out what changed. But if you can show them on a weekly basis, here's the changes that were made and a classification, they'll just go there, review the changes, and if they need to see what the context is, they can jump to that part of the package. So, as you're doing this, you've got to update whatever your system of record is. Again, that's that point in time truth. I log everything with an effective date because I need to know when something's been introduced. And the surest way to hold your stakeholders accountable is to show when they signed off and approved stuff. Because one of the interview questions, and I'll tip my hat right now for you, is you get to a final stakeholder meeting after acceptance testing, and they've gone through the system and they played with it, and you're ready for that joyous sign off, and you're going to bring the cake out on a cart in just a minute, and they say, no, this isn't what I need. This doesn't match anything I was hoping to get. What did you do? So then I ask my candidates who are interviewing for BA positions, what do you do next? Ask PMs the same thing. And the best candidates tell me, well, that could never happen. We've reviewed it so many times. I have their sign-off. If they're saying something doesn't work, then unless we missed something, and we'll check, but it's not there. It's net new. Let's see how we can deal with it. And then as you go along, you may need to update and change your process depending on how things are going. If you're seeing resistance in some areas, you want to adapt this. You want to make this as easy to do business with as possible. So this cycle, validating the change, updating requirements, tracking the change, packaging and communicating, continues over and over again. And this is just our basic cycle we're going to build on. And tracking changes can be really easy. If you're using the outline format in Word or whatever your tracking ID is, you can have basically a requirement ID or requirement number that you can track from. And so what I typically do is, in some cases, there was an update. So this was the previous requirement, this is the new, this is skewed to narrative requirements. Or if there was a defect, you can use a defect ID and say, here was a requirement, and then here's the new one. So you're showing before and after. Again, you're making it really easy. That way people can quickly look, decide, okay, here's what I thought it was, here's what it is now, what's the difference, and then I can look at it in context if I need to. Does that make sense?
These are all manual entries, right?
These are manual entries. Some of the better requirements tools, and I think there's some vendors out here, have awesome ways of even putting in change notes or packaging requirements and even spitting them out into templates. So if you're using a tool, my best advice is go with the tool. If you've got SharePoint or any other collaboration site, this is a simple list. I mean, this is really easy to put in. You can do it in a spreadsheet. You can do it. This actually was a cut out of a Word doc, is what I had to use at the time. So what happens if I need an approval? So I still have that whole same update process, but now I have to add the impact review. What is the impact? What's the cost? Is everybody going to agree to that? And this is where you're preventing the death by 1,000 cuts, where you've made so many little changes and each one on their own was no big deal, but then you put them all together and you're just nauseous. It's like being on a carnival ride. With this, it can be as formal or informal again as you want. In one system, we were doing a complete replacement and upgrade of a system, which meant on a weekly basis, we had to evaluate every production defect and determine whether they were allowed to make it in production, because anytime they made a production change, we were going to have to cascade that into the new system. And so some changes, some customer defects did not go in because we were so close to implementation. Then decide, do we need a change control? Is it significant enough that you need a governance change control because you are fundamentally changing the foundation of the project? This is also your step where the BAs get to manage the project manager. Because the project manager may be either overkill, saying, no, I want a formal change control on everything and drive everybody crazy, especially if they're a micromanager. Or they could be the reverse, where they're like, no, nothing matters, it doesn't matter. And you're like, you know, this is going to add $500,000 to our project. I think you might want to get approval for that. The other is, this change control can be used for creating an approved document to go along with your governance process. So if you've made changes, you can take a snapshot and say, this is my next dot version of the requirements. We are approving all included changes for the change control log up to this point. This is now the official version. And when we do that, what we do is we then can go into our, if we're using track changes in Word or a system, we create a snapshot, and that's the new version that we're now working from. It also gets all the little noise. Because if you think about it, all the spelling corrections, the elaborations, all those things you've been doing, get that out of the way. Take a snapshot, start with a clean document, but I wouldn't do that more than, depending on how fast your project's going, not more than once a sprint, not more than every couple weeks to every month if you're doing more of a waterfall or longer term project. And then after you implement the change, of course, you're going to kick back off into your update process as you discover new changes.
With some
Yep.
of these, with some of these automated systems, they'll give you the difference between one baseline and another.
Yep.
So if you have all these little
Yep.
trivial changes, and you have significant changes, material changes,
Yep.
there's nothing that differentiates between the two. Are you suggesting baseline, change all the insignificant stuff, baseline it, and then compare it?
Not necessarily. So if you're using a compare function, it's going to spit out a list of all changes, and that's good for approval. But I think you're still missing one step, which is how are you classifying the change as you're making it and the reason for the change. So depending on the tool, if as you make an edit, there's a way to comment, annotate, or log a reason for a change. The other is use your defect. So most of those packages also either integrate with your QA software or have their own basic QA. Create your own requirements QA testing. I have always had my developers and QA testers QA my document, and we basically ran through defect testing where they log, and then I logged the reason or outcome, missed requirement, ambiguity, elaboration, new requirement, constraint. And basically that way I could run a report at the end and say, yeah, we had 80% requirements volatility, but 70% were benign. They were wording changes, they were language differences, they were elaborations to make it easier to understand or additional supporting documentation. So I definitely work it into your process, but the compare is a good way of packaging it and then doing that weekly, every 2 weeks, every month, stamp of approval for all the changes. And at that point, it's a formality. I mean, I've never had anybody look at it and say, no, I don't, that number 17, I don't really remember approving that. They're just blanket approving it, and I can use that to burn them a little later if I need to. I mean, but that's part of it. You got to protect yourself. I keep every single email in compliance with our records retention plan. I would keep it longer if we had a longer retention plan, but because I go back and I pull those approvals, I pull that documentation and say, that's fine, yes, and I think I can help you. We approved this on this date, and here's the change in the impact. We accept it. So now if we want to go back and do it, here's what the new impact is. So you're helping them, but you're holding them accountable so that they can't say, well, I expect to get free work. There's no such thing. It's constable. There's no such thing as a free lunch. So with this, you also need to track approvals. And you can do this in a spreadsheet where you have whatever the change control is, the date, the reason, status, how many hours or what the impact is. Does it affect your targeted release? I track the dates for every stage of that. You can track what the comments were. So this is where, even before these requirements tools had the robust functionality, I used my team to QA the requirements. So what I would do was, we had a spreadsheet, and doing this a lot with offshore saved us so much time and money. I actually developed this when I worked for an offshore company. And what they would do is, every single night, they would go through the document and they would post questions, changes, anything that they thought wasn't right, and then I would pick it up the next day, review, and I would tell them, was it a valid issue? If so, what was I going to do to fix it? And this is where you can get a lot of, like I said, you're trying to clear the noise out. I mean, which is really the heart of Lean, is get all the waste out of the way. We had one log where the requirement was the actor/user will be limited to a 30-minute session before being automatically logged off. Defect logged. It is impossible to divide actors by users. Little too, it was very little interpretation. Those are the things you can get by, and so that's when we said, okay, it's either actor or user, one in the glossary, and here's what it means. And so by cleaning up our language, we got the understanding. I also learned a really humbling thing about myself. If I had answered the question by saying I was right 3 times, I was the idiot in the room. Because if, once or twice, if I was like, no, this is exactly how it's supposed to be. When we got to the 3rd time, no, I'm the one missing it. I missed something. What I think I wrote isn't there. It's why you can't often proofread your own work, because you know what you meant to say, which isn't necessarily what was written, or even more so, what people perceive. Because every different person is going to read, interpret, and almost fantasize about what that's going to look like when it's in. And that's what you're trying to lock down a little bit. When you get to governance change control, it can be a template, it can be in one of your tools, it can be on a website, it can be part of your approval process. But at some point, there's some significant things that have to be part of that approval. One is, what's the impact? The cost, the schedule, the timing, any significant changes to the functionality. You don't necessarily need to call them out, but you should reference them. Maybe you've got a package of changes that you're referencing and saying we're going to do this differently. If you're regrouping large numbers of requirements into different sprints or different releases or implementations, or deferring them, this is a great way of taking a whole body of work and setting it to the side. It also is great when you're eliciting requirements, because then you can capture everything and your stakeholders feel validated that you heard what their concern is, but you get all that noise and future wish state out of the way. This is also really great for milestones in the project. If you are part of a rigid governance model for project delivery, if you change your requirements, you have to prove that your requirements sign-off is accompanied by a design sign-off later, which is accompanied by a later date code change. Or you would have to specify that this version of the requirements, which is now approved, is already incorporated into the approved design. So basically, you have to show that you've got everything in a linear order for whatever that time box was. I am a very big fan of right before implementation, getting a final sign-off on your final requirement package. Everything's locked down, and you can say, we all agree this is what we put in. And this is now going to be the basis for the future. So, what are a few best practices that we can all incorporate? The first is, this isn't something you spring on people. Just like your requirements approach, as you tell people how you're going to help get them to the point of design, and through testing, and through implementation, tell them what the change process is going to be. Tell them what to expect. Show them some samples. Say, hey, we're going to see some cleanup in language. We're going to see some rewording. You're going to change headers and error message text. Those are really important. But they're not a material change to what we all agree we're trying to build. So here's how we're going to manage those. But then you're going to ask for some new stuff. You're going to ask to pull in a new data feed and do new validations or have new non-functional requirements. Here's how we're going to manage those to make sure that we continue to deliver on time and that you know exactly what the impact of those changes will be so we can make sure that they're prioritized correctly. You want to maintain, you've got to be consistent. So however you set this up, you have to have the diligence to stick with it during the entire life of the project. If you get lazy, you will get burned. It's inevitable. So maintaining, you've got to build this into your schedule, build this into your throughput, into your team assignments. You've got to have the overhead to handle at this level. The impact assessment is there's nothing more important to your risk management strategy. And when you work with a lot of PMs and they talk about managing risk and what the mitigation is, I think this gets lost. What you're really looking for is, did you get the right people to analyze and assess what the change was so that we know all the downstream effects? Is it going to work with the hardware you've put in place? Are you going to now have to change your training? What's going to be the end user impact to end user impact? We have a customer service, client service system where we use to basically manage a whole set of accounts. And we know that there's a lot more it needs to do. So the teams came up with an awesome way of accelerating those changes. So instead of just releasing it, doing releases 3 times a year, we could now potentially do releases every single month and roll out functionality. Everyone think that's an awesome idea?
Yeah.
Getting end users, now we're going from 3 to 12. This is going to be great. Even if we take out a month for holidays or odd schedules, we still get 11 releases compared to 3. Our operations team hated it. And the reason was they couldn't roll it out. It took them 3 to 6 months to get everybody who deals with clients trained on the changes, comfortable with them, and now working the new way. The impact to their jobs was so extreme every time the system changed that the IT department didn't even realize. So they're like, actually, could you just give us 1 release a year? If we had 1 release and it just did everything that was going to be good for that year, then we'd be really good at it, and then we'd be prepared the next year and we could learn the next version of the tool. So that's why, as I talk about, changes aren't changes to a system. They're a change to the way you do business. If a new system is a change, you are changing people, operating processes, you're changing fundamentally how certain business rules may be impacted because you're doing something different. If not, then you're doing a project that has no deliverable, which some of us may have been on this before, but not intentionally from the beginning. Leverage whatever tools you have. When I've talked about systems in other presentations, people were like, well, everything seemed to be focused on SharePoint. I did a lot in SharePoint because it's free, it's easy, it was available. If I had an awesome requirements tool, I used it. If not, I built what I need. Just take whatever is available. You can do everything you want in the simple list view on any collaboration tool. Because all of this really is list data, and the best requirements tools are just really, really robust list managers. I am a huge advocate for cross-referencing. If you like requirements traceability, you have found your new OCD obsession. Change management and tying the changes to the dates and the reason and the source. It also can be a validation and a reinforcing behavior for your organization. If you can call out that the testing team was responsible for discovering 80 ambiguities this month, which will now not cost us 30 times as much to fix when they get in, you are supporting their behavior, calling them out and giving them recognition, even though they're doing work to help you out. That's a great way of getting people to participate and acknowledging them for what usually is a confrontation between us and groups that are telling us, we don't like what you said, you need to do it differently. And we're like, but I'm right, I'm the BA. I know what the business needs. I represent the business and the product and the process. You guys are just project people. As the project ends, you don't exist until another project stops. But I live on as long as the business lives on. So you can use this to really build your team morale. And it's a little rough, especially working offshore, but you can really build up to it. So what if we wanted to turn our entire life into a giant change? So really, this is based on the fact that whatever you do at this moment, before a project starts, is your baseline. It can be manual operations, it can be legacy systems, it could be whatever area you're working on. But at some point in time, a system or a business or a function does a certain thing, and that's your baseline. So when you go in, and this is where Agile has put together sprints, is you look and say, what do I want to change? What needs to be different? What needs to be better? What needs to be fixed? And that subset of the baseline requirements is my project. So this is our solution. This is our project. And together, they become our new baseline, our new future state. And the minute I get that into production, it now reverts back and becomes my new baseline. So everything I do, you can start getting your organization to think about it in terms of change, in terms of a baseline. Because if anything, you're really the real value in this is getting people to stop thinking about the tool you're working on, and I'm assuming most people are IT based here, and start thinking about the business operation. I witnessed a group who moved an entire highly regulated process into a new tool that is the best in the industry. So they moved an entire set of operational functions into this tool, and it gives us so much flexibility, reporting, much better control over this area. And as we were getting close to implementation, and there was a lot of grumbling as they started really trying to use the system, and they were trying to do their jobs, and they kept running into problems or shortcomings. They're like, but I can't do this, I can't do this. And I stopped and had a conversation with some of the stakeholders, and I was like, let me get this straight. So the frustration you're having is, you did have all these manual workarounds, you had all these manual processes, all these ways of tracking, because you had to do everything using inferior tools. So you just spent a lot of money pulling all those bad habits forward into a robust system that is designed to eliminate that. And it's like, well, I don't really want to say it that way. I was like, well, look, just think through some of your typical processes, some of your frustrations. How many steps, how much of people's daily job could have you gotten rid of if we started by saying, what's the outcome and how do we get there in this tool? And he's like, we could have saved 50%. We over-engineered a system. The processes over-customized it by 50% or more, and I think, I'm guessing it would be more. Just because we weren't focused on the business, we weren't sitting down with the end users and figuring out not what they were doing, which is the question we ask, but what is the outcome? What is it we're trying to accomplish? And refocusing the project. So if you can shift this way, where you understand that it's the operation. If you're doing a context diagram, this is that center box that touches all the people, all the other systems, all the other processes. This is your solution in the center. And what you change is going to create your new solution. And especially if you're operations focused, process focused, this is a great way of getting time to be able to do that. So let me jump back to the conclusions here. So the principles we talked about, I mean, there's nothing earth-shattering here. I don't think I told anyone anything that they probably didn't know or hadn't seen before. Instead, it's a way of leveraging it and saying, take those best practices and slide them and apply them to your requirements. Turn them into a way of working, a way of behaving, and you'll get much better results. Also, how you track, how diligent you are, how tight you control, has to be related to how much of a material impact the requirements have. You know, you could basically say, spelling and grammar, I'm not even going to track. There's no reason, there's no value, it's a waste of everyone's time. Okay, that works. If you've got a group that can get past that, absolutely go for it. Some of your lower level changes may fall into that. You've got to find what's right for you in the organization. If you are in a really complicated release that is impacting a lot of areas, you may want to really tighten and lock things down even more. Your consistency and diligence throughout the process is going to determine how successful you are. This is not something that can ebb and flow throughout. You have got to do this every single day, every single week, every single month. Because if not, and you let off for a little bit and then come back, you're going to have resistance. Whereas if you're doing this every day, you'll actually see the resistance go down so low that people will only start focusing in on those important material changes. They'll be really quick to go, yep, okay, let's go. And it really then, just like we try and prioritize scope and everything's high priority, you don't want your change management for requirements to be the same thing. You want to get people in the habit of focusing in on what's a priority. And because their time's valuable, that will happen naturally because they're just going to want to only look at that end state that's most important. And the little stuff that you've got and you know you've got, you can just basically get a blank check approval on that. This is available for download immediately. My website's listed on the green card, so you can grab it. These are the references, so please feel free to steal, reuse any of this. Take full credit, put it into your organization. Also on the website, because I couldn't make a download available in the room, I have templates and examples that you can download and grab. So there's a zip file that has those. They are manual templates, but manual templates are a little universal so you can at least get the idea and then take a look at what are the fields, how is this tracked, what are some of the changes. So feel free to reuse any of those you want. Standard information about the bank. And also, one of the best things about conferences like this is staying connected. So please feel free to connect online with LinkedIn, grab my cards, make sure that we stay in touch, and I'm always available to help. So we've got about 12 minutes left. So wanted to kind of open it up, and we can bounce back to other slides for questions. Does anyone think that they've learned some things that they would be able to apply in their organization? At least a few ideas. Did anybody already doing this and there's nothing new they learned or could apply? Okay, good. Wanted to make sure. Yes?
I think I'm going back to the beginning, and maybe you've answered this in the data, but when we said that the thing that's cut most is requirements,
Yep.
I don't disagree with this. My first reaction is it seems like a lot of effort, so they're not going to want to pay for that effort to do this diligence. And
Great.
so I think it's about how to start. Like I understand once you start, they're used to it, but how do you start? Because we're cut all the time.
Okay, let me say that back to you and emphasize one of the things you said. We're trying to cut out all the time up front in the project because we don't want to pay for it.
Yeah. So we show them this.
Are we paying for it?
Yeah.
How much more are we paying for it if we don't do it up front? There was an article, and I believe it was on Fast Company, and actually I have a blog entry on my website written about how to fail fast. Pixar, and it's amazing. Has anyone ever seen a bad Pixar movie? Has there ever been a flop? Do we have Pixar BAWorld 2?
No.
You don't, because their entire operations is designed to weed out inferior ideas. Everyone who's contributing, every afternoon after lunch, brings their ideas forward into an auditorium, and anybody from the janitor all the way up to the head of design comments, and they discuss it, and they weed out all the bad ideas. And by the time they get to actually coming up with the concept for the movie, they've already worked out a lot of the problems. And then as they go through, they're working out the storyboards and the storylines, and maybe they're doing little bits of sample art. So instead of discovering that you want to redo, and your character, instead of being a teddy bear, is now going to be a polar bear and vicious, and he's going to be the enemy, and you were already in shading and fur, I mean, think about the cost at that point. They do it back in wireframes. And if you ever get the advanced versions of their movies, you can actually see almost entire versions of the movie as sketches that people have hand sketched, and it shows how things are going to work. And it's kind of a little scary, I will say, but it's really cool. So the key is to, the stats, people will be like, yeah, okay, whatever, but still I want you to cut it. See if you can find stories. See if you can find past examples. Like you say, hey, remember when we put System Bob out? And then we rolled it out to everybody, but you couldn't print and you couldn't do reports? That's an example of this category. So, yeah, I wanted to spend $10 here, and instead we spent $100 fixing it in production. Or this might have cost us 100 man-hours, instead it costs us 10,000. Yes. Sorry. I have trouble with that. So that's where you can start telling the stories, or break it down and say, let's give this a try. Let's see. So what they're really saying is, they're not saying don't waste time at the beginning. What they're doing is saying, I want to see results. So the more you can give them results, screens, samples, wireframes, storyboards, stories, anything like that, the better. So the faster they can see something that they can touch and play with, even better. Yes?
In your impact piece, you talk about the triple constraint. Do you ever do impact against benefit and how the company's actually going to work when this is done as opposed to
Awesome.
triple constraint?
So value realization is often missed when you look at cost. So lost opportunity, lost revenue, lost cost savings, absolutely. The hardest part is you really have to have a somewhat mature organization who actually has the ability to agree on how they're going to measure that before it'll work. I have been in organizations, not going to name names, where every business case had outstanding ROI and really low total cost of ownership and no measurement after the project ever went in that anyone was held accountable for. In areas like that, you can start to introduce those things, but if they can't even put it in the business case, it's going to be an uphill fight. But no, absolutely, I agree. Putting it in terms of man hours or cost savings. If we do this manually, it will cost us this many dollars per transaction, and here's our current cost. If we can automate it, here's what the breakdown is. And sometimes that also shows you, I'm a big believer in lean. Before I even knew what lean was, I just hate waste, I hate repetition. It gives you an idea of where to target where something might be broken. I discovered in a project where we we captured information in the digital system, we generated a PDF, we printed the PDF and faxed it to the other department that needed to process it. They rekeyed all the information into their system so that they could generate the PDF. I was like, can't we just use that PDF? We could just email it. I mean, one manual email step, put it on a file share, something like that. So absolutely, the more, and that also changes, when you want to talk about impacting the culture of an organization, not only are you teaching them to focus on operations, you're now helping them focus on value, total cost of ownership, ROI, but in tangible terms. So the more you can set those parameters at the beginning of the project, the easier it'll be to use those as foundational steps.
Are you implying that knowing I'll say KPI, the performance indicator, should be an attribute of your requirement?
Yes, in a righteous world, I would absolutely agree. Have you ever been able have you ever been in an environment where that was possible?
No, you end up scrapping it because it's too much energy to get people to agree.
Yeah.
It's a ton of energy to get people to agree. But I have had some instances where it did, and guess what? That whole implementation, everything went smooth, and performance was great. Adoption was there because we knew how we were going to measure it.
Yep.
And that's what people work towards. What's your paycheck? Who's signing your paycheck based on what?
If you can get those in coming from the product manager or the stakeholder or the person who has operational savings that they need to tie to it, it'll be a lot easier. Even if you're feeding words, like doing a little puppet, and you're feeding the words and feeding the metrics through them, they will love you, and it will, even if you can say, guess what? If we can show this, isn't your bonus going to be awesome? Because, look, you're going to have tangible results. Absolutely. So that's a great component that I usually don't get into, just because this tends to be kind of a big piece to swallow and internalize. Other thoughts or questions? Yes?
Back to this lady's observation / question. It's kind of hard to prove a positive, so if you've got enough time up front to do the requirements properly, they generally don't tie it into the fact that there isn't much rework. And if there is a lot of rework, they don't want to tie it back into the fact that you didn't give them enough time for the requirements.
Yep.
It's almost, willful blindness.
Yep. A few ways of doing that is if you're using a QA tool, which more people have QA tools than they do requirements tools in their environment.
Yeah.
Go back to similar projects or pull rough estimates and say, for a $1 million project, we averaged 400 defects during this phase, 800 defects during this phase. Then run through your project pushing a little bit and say, we reduced that to 100 defects across the entire test cycle that were valid defects. But I also hold the QA team accountable, and I won't let them get away with defects that are not true defects. I want to quantify them, so I'm going to capture that as a field and then draw reports and show what the cause is. And it may take time, but so if you're in an iterative environment, every cycle gives you more data to build that case and educate people. If you're in waterfall and 16, 18-month projects, you're looking at a decade's worth of work. So practice, and then find a company that appreciates you. And I can help you with that tomorrow.
After I retire.
All right. Thank you so much for coming out. Please grab a photo for your cube if you'd like, and my business cards. And thanks again for coming to the session.